Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Impressionism. In the last chapter, we left off talking about photography and architecture, but before that we were looking at a movement called Realism. And Realism, in many ways, is really the first modern art movement. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that, one of the sort of central concepts of modern art is that art must be challenging. It must constantly be pushing against the status quo. And it must be, if it's doing it right, and if it's significant and important, then it must be avant-garde. What do I mean by avant-garde? Well, avant-garde, remember, technically is a French military term. It means the forward guard, but it's this idea that art must always be pushing forward and breaking boundaries and pushing the envelope, or whatever metaphor you want to use, for doing something different and challenging. Part of this comes from this modernist idea that the newest thing is always the best thing. And this is something that will certainly continue through art and is a major influence on the Impressionist movement. So, avant-garde. Let's take a quick little look here at our map. You can see that modernization is sort of raging through Europe as we see the industrialization of Europe. We see more and more people moving from rural areas into urban areas. We see this sort of explosion of the Industrial Revolution, and in urban centers we see the building of factories. We see the ability now to mass produce lots of various goods. We are seeing, because of the railroad, we are seeing the world get smaller. It is now easier to travel. This also means that it's easier to trade. We are seeing really the first sort of beginnings of modern globalization and this more interconnected world in this period, in the sort of the mid-1800s. And of course this is affecting the world of art, which is what we're concerned with here in our art history survey course. In 1863, Napoleon III, the leader of France at the time, established the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused. And we have already seen this reference to this in Edward Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Luncheon on the Grass, which was exhibited in 1863. So, what this means is that the Academy, the Grand Salon, the big sort of government body that sort of oversaw and sort of made the rules and stipulations about what is and isn't good art, is starting to lose its grip. And people are becoming interested in art outside of these sort of accepted parameters, and they want to see the weird stuff. They want to see the stuff that breaks the rules. Sometimes, simply to make fun of it or to be titillated by the weirdness of some of this art. But in other cases, there's a genuine interest for wanting to see something new. In 1867, Manet, in kind of imitation of his hero Courbet, mounts his own private exhibition, which also helps sort of create interest in art that is outside of the Academy. And then through 1874 and 1886, we're going to see a group of artists that we're going to focus on exclusively today called the Impressionists, who are going to exhibit, who are going to have several of their own salons and exhibit their own work. And this is going to really, really be a game changer in terms of creating new different kinds of methods of painting, new ways of seeing the world, and really helps to legitimize this sort of avant-garde movement. Okay. So we can't talk about Impressionism without talking about one of its founding members, Claude Monet, whose work Impression Sunrise is the work from which Impressionism gets its name. This is a painting of Monet's hometown, Le Havre. It was exhibited at an exhibition of painters, sculptors, engravers, etc. held at the studio of the French photographer Nadar, this kind of eccentric balloonist photographer who we studied last time. This work was reviewed by an art critic named Louis Leroy, and Leroy said, "Man, these guys are a bunch of impressionists." And he took the term from Monet's work here, Impression Sunrise, and he meant it as an insult. It was a pejorative sort of slam against these impressionists, meaning in a way they were kind of impersonating real painters, and they give the impression of being paintings and painters, but it's really not. But these impressionists took that insult and sort of ran with it and said, hey, you know what? This is exactly what we're trying to do. We are trying to create an impression of what we see. And so they really sort of took to heart, they really took to heart this concept of Impressionism, and they changed their name from Painters, Sculptors, Engravers, etc., Incorporated, to the Impressionist. I love how they just kind of own this term that's meant to be derogatory, and they just run with it. I love it. All right. So this painting, in many ways, all of the things that all of the aspects of Impressionist art are here already in 1870, and painted in 1872 and exhibited in 1874, I believe. So we're looking at a seascape. We're looking at an image of a port. We're looking at a sort of modern day industry. We're looking at images of shipping. We're looking at these modern ships in this very industrial kind of environment. So that's a key aspect of Impressionism, is that it's modern day, just like realism was modern day. In fact, a lot of the concepts of realism carry over in Impressionism, but there's some key differences too. Realism is often very political. Realism is often meant to sort of address the grievances and concerns of oppressed classes of people, whereas Impressionism doesn't really care. Impressionism is more objective and less subjective. It is less interested in social justice and more interested in just kind of showing you how the world is with no real judgment call. Also, whereas a lot of realist art is focused on rural subject matter and the sort of images of the peasantry and the farmers and workers and field hands, what we see in Impressionism is a much more urban and urbane sort of subject matter. Interest in large cities as opposed to rural areas. Interest in middle and upper classes as opposed to poor and working classes. But there's still, like realism, this desire to show the world as it really is. But the lens is just focused on kind of a different aspect of society. If we also look at this painting, you can see that Impressionism is a lot more experimental than realism is. The brushstrokes are a lot less defined. The imagery is a lot more abstract and less realistic. In fact, one of the concepts we talked about in realism was this idea of truth to materials. And this is something that Courbet would do, where he would emphasize the sort of paintiness of the paint by using this palette knife. And when we would look at his paintings, we would see that thick impasto. And there's no, denying that what we were looking at was paint, not rocks, not grass, not sky. And the Impressionists take that and push that even further, to the point that when we look at an Impressionist painting up close, there's no sense of illusion here. Let's zoom in. Let's take a look. Look at this thing. This is insane. If we look closely at Monet, sort of the great artist of the Impressionists, and also don't confuse Claude Monet with Edward Manet. They were friends. Manet was sort of a mentor to the younger Impressionists like Monet, but you don't want to confuse their names. So Monet, as they say, more Monet, more problems. Yeah, you can skip over that. Okay, so if you look closely, you'll see something we call the broken brushstroke, these choppy, disconnected brushworks. And you can especially see that in the sunlight reflecting on the water here. When you get up close, it's almost like Monet is emphasizing the fact that this is made from paint. He's not trying to hide the fact, but he's trying to, in a way, like emphasize that fact. He's being true to the materials. He's letting paint look like paint. He's also interested in a concept called local color, which is just the effect that light reflecting on an object is modified by the colors around it reflecting upon its surface. What does that mean? Well, it means this. For instance, this is a red coaster, right? And if I put this next to this black pad, all of a sudden there's little bits of red reflecting onto that pad. And it's no longer just black, but the objects around it locally are reflecting and influencing it. Ooh, pretty cool. But then if I take another object, say something that is blue, and then now all of a sudden there's a little blue in this black surface. So local color is just artists sort of realizing that colors aren't pure, and colors just aren't light and dark in various sort of shades. And I know this is something Vermeer kind of came up with 200 years ago, right? But these Impressionists are really jumping on this almost scientific kind of aspects of color, and they're starting to explore how colors are working with each other and how they influence each other, and kind of studying the scientific effects of color and impact of color. Because, you know, we are now in the modern world, and science is sort of exploding, and we are starting to really understand how the world works, and we are getting a much better grasp on physics and a real understanding at this point of how light actually works. And some of these Impressionists, like Monet especially, is really interested in this scientific aspect of color. And he's reading journals, he's reading scientific theories about color, and he's incorporating these concepts into his artwork. Hello?
We've been trying to reach you concerning your cars.
So he's incorporating these sort of scientific aspects of color into his painting. Also, these artists are starting to paint outside in what is called plein air, which means simply outside painting. And certainly artists have painted outside before, but most artists, up until the Impressionists, are primarily working inside studios, and they're finishing works, even if they began them outside, they're finishing them in the studio. But Impressionists are influenced by and taking advantage of a new technology, tubes of paint. And these pre-mixed tubes of paint take a lot of the hard work out of painting for these artists. They don't have to mix the paints themselves in the studio, but they can just buy a tube that's already mixed, and this means it's really portable. So they can now take their easels outside and set them up. And these artists are really jumping on this plein air bandwagon. And artists like Monet are setting his, he's setting his easel, for example, in front of this sunset. So he's painting what he is seeing. He's not like hiring a model. He's not setting up some still lifes and painting over a series of weeks or even months. But instead, he's trying to capture what he's seeing as it occurs instantaneously, very quickly. And so he's painting very fast. He's also generally painting on very small canvases as opposed to large paintings that you would see in the Art Academy. And he's painting into this very quick brushstrokes. One of the reasons why the Impressionists invented this quick brushstroke was not just sort of to explore different ways of mixing color and explore this concept of local color, but they were also interested in getting the image down as quickly as possible, very much like a camera. And this photography is really influencing the way these Impressionists are working too, because they want to be able to capture things quickly and instantaneously, like a camera does. Because this is the modern world. It's moving fast. You don't have time to sit there and paint for hours and hours and days and months and years. But you got to get it fast, or this world's going to pass you by. So Monet. Monet is from a successful shipping family, like many artists we studied before, kind of all the way back to Michelangelo. This is a guy whose father wanted him to sort of take over the family business, and he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. He decides to kind of leave his family, and he goes and he starts training as an artist. He studied under a guy named Jacques-François Richard, who is a student of David. He meets another guy, and a guy named Eugène Boudin, in Normandy, who becomes kind of a mentor, and he taught Monet how to paint in oil paints. In 1857, Monet's mother dies, and he goes to live with an aunt. He eventually moves to Paris, and he meets Edward Manet. And in fact, Manet paints this image of Claude Monet in his studio boat. So I love this image. This is Monet working in plein air with his wife, or I think she was his fiancée, Camille, at this point, sitting next to him and painting the world that he sees, painting nature, painting boats in the river. But in the background, you see these smokestacks, this industry, this modern life that was a huge influence on the Impressionists. He was drafted into military service, but he gets typhoid fever. He could have actually, his father, with his financial pool, could have probably gotten him out of the military service, but Monet and his father were estranged by this point, and so he has to go into the military service, but he gets typhoid fever, and his aunt basically gets him out. In 1862, he studies with another artist, Charles Glière, and he really starts to develop what will be eventually called his Impressionist style. In 1873, he forms the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers, which will eventually become known as the Impressionist. In 1879, his wife Camille dies, and then eventually he remarries and moves west of Paris to a place called Giverny, where he spends his later years. Monet is a guy who started very much on the avant-garde, very much sort of out in left field, very experimental. His art didn't sell well. But by the end of his life and the end of his career, and you can see he lived a very long time. He lived into the mid-1820s. He died very, very successful and incredibly influential, and considered one of the fathers of modernist painting. And this is actually not untypical of Impressionist artists and avant-garde in general, because the avant-garde, the idea is that you're ahead of the curve, is that you are pushing out into weird new territory, and oftentimes your art is misunderstood and it doesn't sell well, and many of these Impressionist artists and avant-garde artists period kind of suffered from their weirdness. But eventually society catches up, and what was once out there and sort of left afield now becomes the mainstream. And that is certainly what happened to Impressionism. Because when we look at Impressionist art now, it looks very beautiful and sort of to our eyes that are accustomed to it. It looks sort of quaint and sweet and colorful and pretty. But at the time, it was really out there. It looked unfinished and sloppy and messy and aggressive, and people were kind of freaked out by it. And it just didn't follow the rules at all, with its broken brushstrokes and sort of weird subject matter and some other aspects we'll be talking about. So some more Monet. You can see as he progresses, his art becomes more abstract. The brushstrokes become more brush strokey, right? They become a more evidently, paint just sitting on a canvas as opposed to, trees or hillsides or whatever it is. Another aspect of Impressionist art is a fascination with technology in the modern world. For Monet especially, he was fascinated by public transportation. And this image of Saint-Lazare train station in Paris, we can see that fascination with modern technology. And look, I love the way he's painted the smoke coming out of these steam locomotives here, a major aspect, of course, of modern transportation. As Monet got older, he became more fascinated with light and the way light worked. And he started painting these, really I can only explain them as sort of experiments with light. Like scientists who will, to explore phenomena, will often watch the effect of a certain phenomenon over time. Whether they're studying disease or they're studying some sort of astronomical event or whatever it is. Monet would do this with light, and he would paint the same objects over and over and over and over again at various moments throughout the day, various times of the year. And for example, this is a painting, these are three various paintings he did of a cathedral called Rouen Cathedral. And even though he's painting from the same angle, he's painted at different times of day, exploring how the color changes, how the sunlight reflects off things like the pavement and the nearby trees and other buildings, and the different sorts of qualities in the atmosphere will change the sunlight to where the building almost looks like three different buildings. The only thing has changed is not the physical aspect of the building itself, but the light around it. And for Monet and Impressionism, light is everything. And Monet really becomes obsessed with it and starts to experiment in the way that a scientist would experiment with a subject. So modern day life, the modern everyday world is a huge aspect of Impressionist painting. This is another Impressionist artist, Gustave Caillebotte. And you can see that Caillebotte's style, while is still slightly abstract, it's a lot more realistic than Monet. These Impressionists, even though they shared a lot of qualities, also had their own individual styles, as we shall see. And this is meant, to capture Paris in modern day sort of 1870s France. In the 1850s, under Napoleon III, there was a huge redesign and modernization of Paris. Sewers and plumbing were upgraded and modernized. Boulevards were widened. Streets were paved. New buildings and shopping districts and plazas and parks were built. Paris was really sort of revived under a guy named Baron Georges Haussmann. And Haussmann is really kind of the architect, literally the architect of modern-day Paris. And this is sort of reflected in this very sort of urban image of modern-day Paris with sort of middle-class and upper-middle-class people in their very smart sort of modern-day outfits, walking through these grand, wide boulevards. This is another image of modern-day Paris, and by another Impressionist, Pissarro, Camille Pissarro, who was mostly self-taught, and in many ways I think his Impressionist work is some of the sketchiest and most impressionistic of the Impressionist artist. He's sort of the flip side of Caillebotte, and this is yet another image of sort of modern-day Paris and its wide boulevards and its hustle and bustle and images of commerce and industry. But I love how it almost becomes sort of an abstract pattern. He's zoomed way out of this image. Also, in both of these paintings, notice the weird perspectives. Impressionist artists sort of start to reject a lot of the traditional compositions of traditional art, which is, in traditional art, oftentimes the subject matter is placed, well, just like I am in the camera here, placed right in the center. And this comes from artists often working in the studio, where they would place their model or still life or whatever it is right in the middle and sort of paint it as if you were almost like a spectator at a play, sitting in the audience and watching everything as if it's set up like a play, and the most important thing is right in the middle. But Impressionists start to experiment with placing their focal points off to the side, or sometimes not having any real focal point at all. And also often trying different angles, either from like really sort of kind of low, or as if they almost were looking at sort of from like a bird's eye view in Pizarro's work here. This, of course, is coming from the influence of the camera and from photography and the snapshot. And the weird cropping that we often see in photographs is being imitated here in Impressionist art. You can really see that in the work of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who in many ways was one of the most scientific, along with Monet, with his interest in color. And he wrote a lot about color and the various theories of how colors worked. And he also talks about how he's more interested in color than he is in the subject matter. While he often would paint people and things and events, he's not really interested in that so much as he's interested in the qualities of color and light. And you can see that in this image, Le Moulin de la Galette. This is kind of a typical Parisian scene of the 1870s, this middle-class sort of weekend view of these people at a dance hall on the outskirts of Paris, sort of having a good time. And first of all, notice the angle, as if he's standing above, kind of looking down, this weird sort of almost semi-bird's eye view. And then also notice how you have people sort of coming in and out of the corners of the frame. And also how like nobody's really posing, but instead you get the feeling that if you blinked your eyes and opened them again, everybody would be in a different place because they're moving through space. But I think one of the most fascinating things about this image is the use of this sort of dappled sunlight. This is unlike any other light I've ever seen in a painting before the Impressionist period. Instead of sort of experimenting with light and dark, he's really playing with this concept of local color and how various objects and sunlight can make the same can change the way color appears, like on this man's sports coat, right? You can really see that effect of the local color, how the light coming through the trees, picking up these greens and oranges and browns, are playing with the colors on his coat. It's fascinating stuff. Edward Manet, not Monet, Manet, is a guy who is very much a huge influence on the Impressionists. I guess you could say he made a strong impression on them. Okay, so this is, Manet never kind of stopped working and developing his style. And he was very much influenced by this younger generation of artists who kind of looked to him as a sort of teacher, as kind of almost a guru kind of figure. And he was influenced by them, and they were influenced by him. And this is an image of the bar at the Folies Bergère. By the time we get to the 1860s and 1870s, there is a big what we call cafe culture going on in Paris, in these sort of bohemian art districts inside Paris. And one of these districts is known for, the Montmartre district is known for its big nightclubs. One of them is called the Moulin Rouge, the Red Windmill. The other one is called the Folies Bergère. And these are these huge, like, mega clubs that have dancing and entertainment and live music and even acrobats. If you look up at the left-hand corner, you can see some little feet hanging down. And you can see Manet has really is adopting this impressionist style. In some ways, if you look at this painting, it has a very traditional composition with the main central subject matter, this woman, this barmaid in the center. But if you look in the background, you can see he's actually doing something really weird and sort of playing with this typical arrangement. Because if you look in the background, once you'll start to realize that you're not looking at the background, but you're actually looking at the foreground. What you're looking at is a mirror. And so you're not looking at what's behind her. But Monet is playing sort of a little trick with us. You're looking at what's in front of her. So you're actually seeing partially what she's seeing. But then once you start looking at it, the mirror or the reflection in the mirror doesn't really make any sense. Because what we should be seeing is directly behind her is her reflection. But instead, he's put it over to the side. He's broken the rules again, just like he did in Luncheon on the Grass, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, where he messes with the perspective and makes that woman in the background way too big. He's playing with perspective again, and he's put the subject matter off to the side. Why? Because he doesn't know how to paint? No, because he knows that we can see this better. And he knows that we can see her more clearly, and he wants us to see her reflection because he wants us to see who she is interacting with. Who is she interacting with? She's interacting with a customer, with a client, with a person who is ordering drinks. And this all of a sudden makes us realize that we are this guy. He is putting us in the painting. We are now role-playing the role of this man, and we are not just observing, but we are interacting, and she is now responding to us. And you can tell by the look on her face, she ain't too happy to see us, is she? In fact, she looks rather despondent and worn down. Why? Well, she's a bartender in a nightclub, and she's working her butt off. She's probably been there for hours and hours and hours, mixing drinks, standing on her feet. This is sort of the modern world that Monet and we still live in. This work of industry, this world of commerce, this world of working for a living in this sort of modern setting. And I love the sort of dichotomy here. In the background, or foreground, whichever, in the mirror, we see these people who are benefiting from this awesome new society, who are going out and partying and having a good time and getting drinks and hanging out with each other. And yet, she's having to serve these people. You know, she's having to work for a living, and she doesn't get to participate in all the fun. And on top of that, you can imagine what this guy is saying to her. This dude is probably, like, hey, baby, are your legs tired? Because you've been running through my mind all night. Not the best pickup line, I promise. But, she's probably getting hit on right and left, as all bartenders do. And so what Monet is actually kind of showing us here, look at the way he's put her on display behind the bar, along with all of the other commodities for sale at the bar. Beer and food and other things that you can buy. And she's just another commodity. She's just another thing this guy wants to get. And she is done. She's like totally over it, isn't she? I love the look on her face. Once again, Monet is playing with this idea of the painting sort of responding to the viewer, just like he did in Olympia, just as he did in Luncheon on the Grass, where these women are sort of turning their gaze back at the man, looking at them, going, yeah, I know what you're looking at. She's over it. She's like, yeah, all right, I've heard every single line. There's nothing you can say that is going to impress me. Just order your damn beer and get the heck away from me. All right, so, sort of a comment on modern society, comment on working class people, comment on the relationship between men and women and how women are often treated as objects or commodities. There's a lot going on here. This is one of my favorite paintings. Edgar Degas Degas is an artist who is less concerned with light and more concerned with weird perspectives and angles. So he kind of differs from some of the other Impressionists, that he doesn't often paint outdoor scenes, but he usually paints interiors. Degas came from a very wealthy banking family, and he loved the nightlife of Paris. He loved the opera. He loved the ballet. And his images often focus not only on performances, but also practices, especially those of ballet performers. And he often had a sort of negative view of women. He could often be considered what you would call a misogynist, but he often thought women were sort of inferior, and he wrote kind of crappy things about them. And yet at the same time, he was sort of obsessed with ballerinas and opera singers and the practice and hard work that they would put into their performances. But notice the bizarre sort of angles here. Once again, this influence of photography with figures cropped strangely at the edges, at the margins of the canvas. So Degas, I'm moving my little picture again. Degas is an artist who is influenced heavily by Japanese art. In fact, many of the Impressionists are. There starts to become a movement, an influence, really, in France and then really throughout Europe in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. We call it Japanisme. And this is an influence of Japanese art. And you can see that in this image of the bath. Here, Degas is moved completely away from sort of traditional Renaissance-based kind of angles. And he is showing us this bizarre sort of overhead angle, which flattens out the pictorial space. It also, look how weird this table looks, and the objects almost appear to be floating on the table. It's almost as if the table is seen from one angle, whereas the woman in the bath is seen from another angle. This sort of flattened, weird perspective is something that Degas took heavily from Japanese art. So we got to talk about Japanese art. So why is it such a big influence? In the 1850s, the American Commodore Matthew Perry opens up trade with Japan. Japan had very limited trade with the European world up until then, and because Japanese was very much an isolationist culture and society. But the Americans really sort of force, like physically, like militarily enforce Japan to trade with everybody. And this opens up Japanese goods now being exported to the rest of the world. And Europeans are really being exposed to Japanese art and culture and ideas for the first time. And in 1867, at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, there is a Japanese pavilion with Japanese objects and items there, and it's blowing people's mind. They're going to see all these cool things. And so people start, like, dressing in Japanese clothes, and women start wearing Japanese kimonos and styling their hair like Japanese geisha. Parisian women start, eating with chopsticks, and Japanese restaurants start opening up. People start purchasing Japanese screens and paintings and prints and furniture, and this Japanisme craze starts becoming a huge deal. But also, one of the things that the art objects that people are really starting to invest in, especially in Paris, are what are called ukiyo-e prints. Ukiyo-e means pictures of the floating world. And these were prints produced in Japan, commercial prints, that were produced commercially in mass. Posters and calendars and books and playing cards and trading cards that Japanese people collected and decorated their homes with start to be exported outside of Japan and imported into France and other places in Europe. And floating world, what does it mean? Ukiyo-e means, the floating world literally means a life of leisure, a life without care, because many of these images from Japan are images of leisure. Images of beautiful women, images of beautiful homes or landscapes. But they're very distinctive looking. They have very brilliant, vivid color. Oh, the Impressionists are loving this. They also have this very different perspective than traditional Western European linear perspective, and we start to see these strange overhead views where the perspective is kind of flattened out. And this starts to really influence Impressionist art. Also the subject matter of sort of people living everyday lives, people going on vacation, people lounging around their homes, is very much in line with what the Impressionists were interested in. And so they start to collect these prints. And boy, oh boy, do they start to have an effect on French art and Impressionist in general. The artist Hokusai especially, and this is the image of his very well-known Great Wave, that are having a massive effect. I mean, look at the background of this painting. If that is not Impressionism, I don't know what is, right? Okay, so Impressionism is a radical art movement in many ways because it is changing the way artists paint. They're going plein air, they're painting outside. It's changing the way how they apply their paint. Instead of sort of smooth blended brush strokes, they're using these crazy broken brush strokes and relying on local color, these colors to sort of blend in with each other as you place them next to each other. They're drawing from outside sources like Japan. Oh, this is kind of part of a trend that we saw beginning in Romanticism and Neoclassicism, this Orientalism, isn't it? This interest in things outside of European culture. Funny how history works. And then we start to see changes in who can paint. And one of the significant things about Impressionism, and don't get me wrong, almost everything about Impressionism is significant in relation to its effect on modern painting. But what we're seeing here is the influence of women in art for the first time in a really, really big way. Yes, we've seen women artists before. But thanks to the sort of loosening up of the French Academy of Painting, thanks to also all of these now independent groups of artists who are showing their work outside of the French Academy and the Grand Salon, this means that more women are allowed to participate because there aren't as many official rules anymore. And so what makes Impressionism such a significant modern art movement, not just because of its sort of it being an avant-garde movement and it's being this experimental movement and it's about modern life and all these other things we've talked about, but is the role of women. Because these aren't people off to the side. But some of the Impressionist painters, these women painters we're going to be looking at, are the leaders of the movement. They're some of the main sort of contributors to the style and ideas of Impressionism. And without them, Impressionism would have been a very different art movement. They are taking, women now for the first time have taken leadership roles in an art movement. And one of them is this artist, Bertha Morisot, who I would argue is in many ways the most radical, along with Pissarro, in terms of the way she applies paint. Her paint is just like a crazed, it's like you took a 5-year-old and gave her a bunch of caffeine and some finger paints. Her painting is in many ways the most sort of intense, sort of wildest, unrefined, and unfinished and aggressive of all of the Impressionist painters. She just painted like a wild animal. The way she applied paint was almost violent. And what's funny is she was this woman from very high society. She was from a very powerful political family. She wanted to study art, but she could not attend the École des Beaux-Arts because she was a woman. So her parents hired a tutor so she and her sister could study on their own and take private lessons. She, being a woman of wealth and influence from an influential family, she was in contact with some of the most influential artists of her day, one of them being the Barbizon school painter Corot, who taught her about plein air painting. She met Monet and Manet while painting in the Louvre. Artists used to go to the Louvre to paint and learn from other artists. She eventually even marries Manet's brother, Eugene, who posed in Luncheon on the Grass. And then she submitted her painting to the 1874 Impressionist exhibition. In fact, I believe she showed exhibited more in more Impressionist exhibitions than any other Impressionist artist. So she's a hugely important and influential part of the Impressionist movement. She, like most Impressionist artists, painted sort of leisure activities, especially though her, because she was associated with sort of the upper classes, often painted sort of these wealthy, powerful classes. Okay. Also, this is important. These women artists aren't important just because they're some of the first really women artists who took leadership roles in an art movement in European art. But also, we've talked about this before, how these women artists give us an insight into a woman's perspective, something we hadn't really seen before, don't get to see often. And so these women artists were, they often painted their own lives. They painted their family, their children, their parents, and we are given a view of women's roles in society and women's culture and women's lives and their daily activities in a way that we had never seen before because men weren't really a part of that. And so these Impressionist artists are really opening up a whole new sort of culture to the world of art that hadn't been there before. But man, I wish you guys could have seen this, because last year at the Dallas Museum of Art, there was an exhibition of Bertha Morisot's paintings. And seeing them in real life is just wild, because you can really see just this aggressive way she applied this paint in thick, sort of impasto, onto the canvas in this aggressive sort of manner. The other big French Impressionist female artist is an American named Mary Cassatt. And Mary Cassatt, in some ways, is very different than Bertha Morisot, but no less radical, but in a very different way. She comes from another wealthy family, an American banking family. She's from Pennsylvania. Eventually, she moves to Paris she moved to Europe just to study art in Italy and Paris. She settles in Paris, starts hanging out with the Impressionists. She meets Degas at the Salon in 1874, and she kind of becomes his friend, which is also weird because Degas was this sort of notorious misogynist, and he didn't like women, and yet he sort of took Mary Cassatt under his wing and mentored her. He's a really interesting character, Degas, because he would say sort of terrible things about women, but he also gave Cassatt her kind of start and gave her the end into the Impressionist movement. People are complicated, aren't they? So Mary Cassatt began exhibiting with the Impressionists. Also because she was a woman, though, she couldn't really hang out in this sort of cafe society that the Impressionists often hung out, in bars and cafes, exchanging ideas. Also, she brought her parents over from America to the United States, and they were elderly, and she was taking care of them. So she had to spend a lot of time at home, indoors, also raising her children. And so she gives us, especially even more than Bertha Morisot, I think, an image of women's domestic lives motherhood and childhood at this time. But also, Mary Cassatt, through her influence by Degas, is the most influenced by Japanese art, I think, of any of the Impressionists. And her art is extremely, I think, out there and radical compared to the other Impressionists. In a very different way, though, than Bertha Morisot, where Morisot's art is very aggressive and wild in her brushstrokes. Cassatt's work draws really heavily from the patterns and the weird angles of Japanese ukiyo-e printmaking. And I think you can see that very clearly in this work called the Coiffure, which is very similar to Japanese ukiyo-e prints, which often women at the bath, or women putting on makeup, or women doing their hair was a very common subject. You can also see not only in the subject matter, but this rather sort of flattened perspective that she's showing us here. Also, you see things like the bold outline around the figure, the sort of empty, flat, negative spaces that are making up the flesh tones here, with none of that traditional chiaroscuro or tenebrism or any of those lighting effects that we have seen from the Renaissance. You can also see just this sort of interest in pattern. The kimono and Utamaro, the Japanese artist work, is imitated here in the patterns in the wallpaper and in the chair in which the woman is sitting. Some more Cassatt. Just the influence of Japanese ukiyo-e prints on her work, I think, is the most obvious. And the fact she also made a lot of prints as opposed to paintings. Japanese works were prints, woodblock prints, and she experimented with woodblocks and lithography, etchings, engravings, really the whole gamut of printmaking techniques. Japanese art was also a huge influence on another American artist, this one working in England, and a guy who's not associated directly with the Impressionists, but was certainly working around the same time as the Impressionists, influenced by the same people as the Impressionists, and certainly aware of what the Impressionists were doing. And this is a guy named James McNeill Whistler. And you can see in this work especially the influence of Japanisme, the influence of Japanese art, with this woman with this golden Japanese screen behind her and this kimono and all of these Japanese textiles around her. You're very much looking at, that influence. Whistler named his artworks really strange things. He named, like this one is called Caprice in Purple and Gold. The work on the left is an image called Nocturne in Black and Gold. These are musical terms. He named his works not after what they were about, but instead musical terms. Why? Because for him, art was primarily design. Art wasn't about telling stories, but art was about using design, color and shape and pattern, for instance, to set a mood, to create a feeling. Just in the way classical music is not literal, right? When you listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it's not about anything, but you feel emotions, right? You respond to it because of the chord structures in the music, because of the rhythm, because the music gets louder and softer. The same way we listen to a lot of music. We listen to music abstractly, don't we? I mean, oftentimes we don't even pay attention to the words, and a lot of music is completely abstract. It is just sounds, right? And McNeill Whistler wanted to do the same thing and have painting express itself primarily through its design, what it looked like, not what it was about. So for him, he used these musical terms like nocturnes or caprices as a way of sort of making a connection between music and art. And he wanted you to look at his paintings not so much what they were about, but how they made you feel. And the arrangements of different colors and patterns and textures on the canvas In the same way that artists arrange, or musicians arrange notes into chords, he wanted to arrange colors into kind of visual chords. He was a proponent of a concept called art for art's sake, which meant that art should have no other real meaning besides just being art. Especially since the camera got rid of this idea that painters have to paint the world as it really looks, because you're actually fulfilling a necessary function here. You're recording the visual world for future generations. Well, we have cameras. We don't have to do that anymore. So artists now are freed up to make art just simply for its own sake. Okay. This painting is rather interesting because it represents sort of the negative way that some people responded to this avant-garde, weird kind of art. The art critic John Ruskin, and we've heard his name before, he was a big proponent of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood that we studied in the last chapter, wrote a review of J. McNeill Whistler of this particular painting, and he said it looked like he was flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler sued Ruskin for libel, took him to court, said that he was, this would tarnish his career, it would ruin his reputation as an artist. And this was a huge court case. It was reported in all the papers. And basically, Whistler wins the case. He wins the trial, but in a very backhanded sort of way. The judge says, all right, this is libel. This did sort of slander your reputation as an artist. But he only rewarded Whistler the total of £1, the English currency, for this. And he spent, thousands and thousands of pounds on this court case. And in many ways, by winning this case, it made him look even worse. He had to, or he won a farthing, not a pound, I should say. But he won, nothing. He won basically like pennies for this thing. So kind of fascinating, right? You probably know Whistler most from this painting, which you might know as Whistler's mother, but he called Arrangement in Gray and Black No. 1. Because even though this is an image of his mother, you get no real feeling about how he feels about his mother, right? Whether he loves her or hates her or cares about her or whatever. She's just another object for him to arrange in the canvas. She's, just part of this arrangement of gray and black. And that's really it. He wants you to view this thing not as a picture of a mother, but as an arrangement of visual elements in a pictorial space. This art is about to get weird, because art is starting to become not about a story, but a lot of modern art is about to become about art itself. It's about to become about design and color and shape and pattern and texture. This idea of truth to materials is really going to start to shift art in the direction that artists are starting to worry more about the concepts of design than they are about telling stories or making art that resembles real life things. Okay, guys, that's where we're going to stop today. I'll see you next lecture.